Okay, let's get started. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us for the ECA monthly national call. I'm Frances Stewart, the chair of ECA's Education Committee and host of tonight's call. For those of you who are new to Elders Climate Action, we are grandparents, great uncles, and great aunts, and everyday folks who are determined to do all we can to leave a livable planet for future generations and for all life. Our program's communications and chapters are focused on engaging elders in building the political will needed to solve the climate crisis. At ECA, we are elder-centered and volunteer-driven, seeking to inform, inspire, and engage older generations to take action on the climate crisis at the local, state, and federal levels. We are always looking for more volunteers to join our national leadership committees, including the education team, who are bringing you tonight's programming. Reach out if you'd like to learn more. We'll drop those links in the chat. Tonight, we are really excited to get to the truth on climate and talk about misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing with Dr. Margaret Hoeflich. But first, let me tell you a little bit about this call. It will be an hour and 15-minute session. Margaret will present, followed by a Q&A, so please feel free to add questions for her in the Q&A box. Following that, we'll have a quick 15-minute action party beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with our partners at the Climate Action Now app. We hope you'll stay for the action party and help us to reach our goal of 4,000 actions for our 2024 action parties. To tell you a little bit more about our speaker tonight, Dr. Margaret Hoeflich is a recent graduate of George Mason University, where she earned her PhD in communication, focusing on climate change communication and misinformation debunking, and working with Mason's renowned Center for Climate Change Communication, or 4C. She's a research to practice scholar, always looking for ways that her research can be applied to make a difference in the world of weather and climate communication, and fostering partnerships between researchers and communication practitioners to maximize effective communication. She holds a BS in meteorology and climatology with a minor in French from the University of Delaware in 2018, and an MS in geography from the University of Georgia in 2020. Outside of her work, Margaret is an ice dancer and a musician, loves being outdoors in any setting, from the beach to the mountains, and will always say yes to a smoothie bowl. So, Margaret, please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Frances. Hi, everybody. I do have my window open over here. It's a lovely night in Philly, so if there's too much background noise, just let me know and I can close the window. But I will get started by sharing my screen. All right. So thanks again so much for having me. I am going to give a little crash course on climate change misinformation. I've titled this presentation, Liar, Liar, the World's on Fire, which is a line from a Dolly Parton song that she released a year or two ago that I had already titled my dissertation, but if I hadn't already formally titled my dissertation, I would have used this as the title. So using it now. I'm going to start by defining what misinformation is, then talk just a little bit about how misinformation spreads, mostly with the lens of social media, because that is really how most information is spreading, and information through word of mouth is spreading in a similar fashion. Then I'll talk a little about how to identify misinformation, how to see when it's happening or when it's popped up in a message. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we combat or work against misinformation through the lens of inoculation theory, which was a big part of the basis for my dissertation work at George Mason. So what is misinformation? These are the two definitions that I used in my dissertation in my introduction chapter. The first on your left is from a 2020 paper that is information that is false, inaccurate, or misleading. And what I want to pull out there is that we have inaccurate or misleading. Misinformation is not always patently false. It can have that sort of hint of truth. But if it is inaccurate or misleading, not necessarily false, that is still misinformation. And then I also like this definition that I compiled from two papers. This is information that contradicts best available scientific evidence. And then I kind of tacked on this idea of without proper scientific justification. Because way back in the day, the idea that the sun was the center of the universe would have been considered misinformation. But we got a proper scientific justification for that fact, and now it's become accepted. So that kind of goes towards this idea of scientific discourse and how science is always evolving, but it evolves through rigorous study, research, and justification. We also hear about information or misinformation by other names. So the first name that you hear very often is fake news. And there's an example of that on the right. This Mark Zuckerberg dead at 32 looks like a news headline. It is not, it is false. But that is kind of the definition of fake news, is that it's specifically misinformation that you are going to think is legitimate news. And then we have disinformation, which is under the umbrella of misinformation, but I put in italics here, it's the purpose of misleading the audience. So whereas disinformation is being put out with that purpose, misinformation doesn't necessarily have that purpose. I kind of like to talk about this in the sense of like a chain reaction, such that maybe a fossil fuel company is purposefully putting out disinformation to throw us off of climate change facts. And then the misinformation would be when someone shares that on Facebook, genuinely thinking that it's true and wanting to inform others of what they perceive to be fact. So it's just kind of an important distinction to think about when we're thinking about intent behind misinformation. I also want to brush a little bit on the topic of greenwashing. I won't go completely into this infographic on the left because the slides will be available so you can look through and browse this on your own. But it's a really, really good sort of quick guide to how to identify greenwashing. This is where a brand or person, what have you, is associated with environmentalism with the intention, note that, to take away practices that are anti-environmental or not good for the environment, climate, what have you. So it is not necessarily false, but it is definitely misleading. It might be true that a company is doing something good for the environment, but they are calling attention to that to make you ignore what they don't want you to think about. So it is a form of disinformation. It is meant to divert your attention elsewhere and mislead you. I have this example of greenwashing that I showed when I taught environmental communication a few semesters ago at Mason. So as you're watching this, think about the product that's being advertised, the message that they're trying to get across, and what the reality kind of is.
Created entirely by nature, it's the best water known to man, because he had nothing to do with it. Bottled at the source, untouched by man, it's Earth's finest water. You don't create the finest water on the planet. You discover it deep below the surface. Bottled at the source, untouched by man, it's Earth's finest water. Fiji water is a gift from nature to us, to repay our gift of leaving it completely alone. Bottled at the source, untouched by man, it's Earth's finest water. Nature has created.
All right, so I'll touch back on this when I get to where we are debunking misinformation and how that kind of works. But keep this idea in the back of your head, the imagery that they're using, the music that they're using, the narrative that they're trying to play, that this is untouched by man and man had nothing to do with it. So they're trying to get you to think that this bottled water is great for the environment. So then moving into how misinformation spreads. I do love a good GIF, some humor in my presentation. So here is Lisa and Homer Simpson. A lot of how misinformation spreads is through users. And this can also kind of be likened to word of mouth. If you're just having a regular offline conversation, these are kind of similar principles. The first one is that when a friend shares something, it's automatically viewed as credible. You generally trust the people who you have in your social circle. So if they tell you something, you are more apt to believe it just because you have a relationship pre-existing with this person. There's also this phenomenon of what Ulrich Ecker is calling interesting if true sharing, where people don't necessarily go through and give context or don't go through and fact check, but they say, hey, wouldn't this be cool or interesting if it was real? And then they share it and it gets accepted as truth. Another thing here is that attention-grabbing headlines are going to spread very quickly and easily. You saw that with kind of the clickbait of the fake news of Mark Zuckerberg dead at 32. Again, people don't necessarily take the time to read things through and will just share something based off of a clickbait headline. And then, like I talked about before, a genuine belief in a misleading claim. Someone truly thinks that this is something that people need to know about, truly believes in some kind of a conspiracy maybe, and then they share that to inform other people. But the technology behind social media is also a huge part of why misinformation spreads the way it does. The first part of this is algorithms, which take note of what you click on social media, and then they show you more of that content. So when I started wedding planning and I started, pausing on my TikTok scroll for wedding content and liking stuff on Instagram that was wedding related, all of a sudden my whole feed is cakes and dresses and seating arrangements and flowers. So it picks up on your interests and then continues to show things with your interest. Then we have lack of moderation or slow moderation, which is part of what my dissertation work looked at. But it's this idea that information moves so quickly on the internet that humans who are moderating maybe comment sections or moderating Twitter, people who are looking for false or misleading content on Facebook cannot physically keep up with how fast this information is moving. There's this quote from Sander van der Linden, who's a very well-known misinformation scholar, that millions of people can be exposed to viral misinformation in a matter of days, if not minutes. So that just goes, it's very fast moving and fact checking can't keep up. So all this kind of in a nutshell is that people are shown information that reinforces their existing beliefs and interests. And then that information is spreading faster than it can be fact checked and verified. So it kind of gets into people's heads before it can actually be debunked or verified, what have you. So keep that one in your back pocket as well as I keep going, this idea of fact-checking existing beliefs and correcting existing beliefs, because that's kind of going to be the basis for how we debunk misinformation through inoculation theory. So a big question, how do I identify misinformation? How do I know that something is false, misleading, or contradictory to the best available scientific evidence? Which is, for someone who is steeped in the science, it's a lot harder when you are not someone who has a bachelor's degree in meteorology and can immediately say like, oh, that's not true. So we just put a little bit of work in, and I have some resources here that have made that work a whole lot easier to identify climate change misinformation claims. So hopefully these will help you in your anti-misinformation work. This first one is called the Flick taxonomy, F-L-I-C-C, and these are the logical fallacies at work in not just climate change misinformation. John Cook, who is the scholar behind most of this, focuses on climate misinformation, but this applies to any misinformation that is out there. But he categorizes all of these faulty arguments into fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories, and then goes into all these little different subcategories of what this might look like. A really big one in climate change, if you look in the red on the left side under the F, this magnified minority or fake debate, you often hear, there's no consensus on the cause of climate change. And that comes from people who are not actual climate experts or magnifying a minority who disagree with that consensus. Another one that you'll hear quite often is this impossible expectations, this idea that, oh, if you can't predict the exact time a thunderstorm will hit my house, you can't predict the climate in the future, even though those are two world separate physics, atmospheric dynamics models. So that's another sort of impossible expectation and misleading claim. So again, I won't go through each and every one of these. The sks.to/flick at the bottom of this slide here will take you to the webpage. So you can follow that. And again, the slides we made available, but this definitely really helps identify what logical fallacies are at work and helps you find them out in the wild, so to speak. Another one that I won't go through in super mega detail, but is super helpful is this CARDS taxonomy. John Cook was also a part of this as well with his primary author. We have the idea that global warming is not happening, which is in red. In yellow, human activities or greenhouse gases are not causing global warming. Number 3 in the green, climate impacts are not bad. Number 4, climate solutions won't work. And number 5, climate movement or climate science is unreliable. So most, if not all, misinformation claims can kind of be put nicely into one of these smaller bins in these subcategories. And that also makes it easier for you to pinpoint what's going on. That if you are reading something on Facebook and it says, oh, the temperature record is unreliable, that fits right into that purple bin on the bottom. So this is a really, really good, clear resource for you to see what the most common claims are. And research is showing that we are more and more often seeing claims in the blue and the purple, the 4 and the 5. This idea that climate solutions won't work or that climate science is unreliable are becoming much more common. So people are still saying that climate change is not real. That's definitely like still a thing that is out there, but it is becoming more common for you to hear, oh, climate change is real, but we don't need to do anything about it. Climate change is real, but doing something is too expensive. Climate change is real, but there is no consensus. Climate change is real, but the media is alarmist. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a next slide. But I do have this citation here if you'd like to look that up. And all my citations are in my last slide as well. This misinformation rhetoric list comes from a very recent book. We just had Genevieve Gunther come and talk to the Center for Climate Communication just a couple of weeks ago. But in her new book, she goes through these 6, I squished innovation and resilience together, but there are 6 chapters in her book. And she talks about kind of the rhetoric that you see in misinformation. So that first one is alarmist. Climate change isn't that big of a deal. We see that rhetoric a lot in misinformation messages. This idea that phasing out fossil fuels is too expensive or the cost is a big kind of like red flag for misinformation. The idea that fossil fuels are needed for economic growth, another red flag. Kind of scapegoating or shifting the blame onto India and China. If their emissions are rising, we shouldn't do anything. That's a big why bother misinformation claim. And then we have this idea of innovation and resilience, that we can invent our way out of climate change, or we can build seawalls our way out of sea level rise, which we can, but we also want to prevent having to do that in the first place. I can show you the cover of this book when we do Q&A. I have it right here on my desk. And the citation is also in my references if you'd like to look this book up. It's called The Language of Climate Politics, but it's a really good, simple guide to these 6 claims, and she goes through in pretty good detail why they're false. I also have one of my favorite resources here is the media bias chart. The citation information on the bottom, if you go to this adfontesmedia.com, they also are putting one out now that's a little bit more simple and not crowded. It has more of like just the big news outlets on there, but they don't have it available for download yet. So I have this one here for you to look at. But if you look on the vertical axis of the graph, that looks at, are we looking at fact reporting on the top, or going down addition of opinion, selective persuasion, misleading information, all the way down to containing inaccurate or fabricated information. And then on the horizontal axis, you have their political leaning or their political bias. So on the left, hyperpartisan extreme left, on the right, hyperpartisan extreme right wing. So what you want to do in using this chart is look at these in the top center. Some of them are USA Facts, Pew Research Center, Stars and Stripes, ABC, BBC, So this is a really good resource. Again, you can look it up on the website, or it will be in my slides that will be sent out to you. A really great way to see what the leaning and the bias and the facts versus fiction versus persuasion versus opinion content in each news resources reporting. So even beyond just going into the climate change messaging, just going right to the source. I had my AP biology teacher in high school used to say, when you use Google, cut off everything past .com, .org, .net, whatever, and just look at that root website. And that's something that I kind of always kept with me. So it's kind of this principle of look at the root website, compare it to this chart, see where it's coming from. Oh, excuse me. Last but definitely not least, perhaps biggest, how do I combat misinformation? What do I do when someone I know is telling me something that I know to be false, inaccurate, misleading, or contrary to scientific evidence? And this is where we get into inoculation theory. This is a theory that basically says that we can vaccinate people against misinformation. It works just like how a biological vaccine works, which is why I have this little infographic on the left of your screen. But you expose audiences to a weakened form of a misinformation message, just like you have dead or weakened viruses or bacteria in a vaccine. You weaken the misinformation message by explaining how that message is false, inaccurate, misleading, contrary to scientific evidence. And then once that's been explained, people then have this sort of immunity. They know why it's misleading, and they're less likely to be persuaded by that message in the future. We do this through building a truth sandwich, a fact, myth, fallacy, fact structure. So if you look on the right, these are the parts of that truth sandwich. We lead with the fact, talk about a myth, warn about it, explain how that myth is misleading, and then finish by reinforcing the fact. For those of you who have seen the episode of Friends where Ross gets his Thanksgiving sandwich stolen, I like to call explaining the fallacy the part in green the moist maker, the piece of bread that is soaked in gravy that really makes the sandwich. That is what's really doing the inoculation, that you are explaining how that myth is misleading. So on the left is a message that I came up with as an example of a truth sandwich. So you might say, unfortunately, Earth's climate is changing too quickly for many species to be able to adapt. Then we warn about the myth. You may have heard the myth that plants and animals can easily adapt to current changes in the climate, but this isn't true. Then when you go in to explain how the myth misleads by saying that plants and animals can adapt to slow changes that occur over thousands of years, but today's climate change is happening much faster. It's only taking about 100 years. And then you go back, reinforcing the fact this is too fast for species to adapt to a changing climate. We also kind of talk about this in the sense of breaking and fixing audience, what we call mental models. So people have these pre-existing ideas of how they think things work. And once someone hears a message that makes sense, that is their mental model of how that what have you works. So in this example, a complete mental model is saying that there's no scientific consensus on climate change because there are scientists who disagree. That is what somebody who believes there's no consensus is thinking. If you only say there is scientific consensus that climate change is human caused, you're breaking that mental model. You'll see I took that gear out of the mental model. If there's no explanation, alternate explanation to back that up, people go right back to the complete model that makes sense to them. So when you tell somebody there is scientific consensus that climate change is human caused, you need to go a step further and replace that missing gear in their mental model. So we do that by saying there is scientific consensus that climate change is human caused because scientists who disagree do not have expertise in climate scientists. John Cook, in one of the resources that I have for you, has a cartoon where it's a person dressed up as a surgeon, and then there's someone on the operating table, and the surgeon says, "Relax, I have a degree in computer science." But you don't want a computer scientist opening your brain. So that's kind of a good parallel there. But we have, in this case, broken this mental model and fixed it with this explanation that scientists who disagree are not experts. To go back to that example of Fiji water that I showed earlier in this presentation, the functioning mental model that that ad is trying to reinforce or produce is that Fiji water is good for the environment because it's bottled at the source in this fancy bottle that's got trees and flowers on it. So if you just say Fiji water is bad for the environment, you've broken the mental model, you need an explanation. Why? It looks like it's great for the environment and has not been touched by humans. They just take the bottle, scoop it up, and put it from the source. Fiji water is bad for the environment because the bottle is single-use plastic, which is not good for the environment on a fossil fuel level and a plastic pollution level, but also because those bottles have to get to you from whatever magical source they're bottling it from, and that transportation happens using fossil fuels. It's a lot more production, emissions, pollution than if you just turned your Brita filter on and refilled your Hydro Flask or Stanley or whatever your water bottle of choice happens to be. So that is bringing back that example of greenwashing, that when we are seeing a message that is a greenwashing message, we want to break this mental model, get rid of the gear, and replace it with this explanation of why that advertisement is misleading, which is, again, how inoculation theory works. We are weakening that misinformation and building people's resistance to that type of argumentation. Another good way to combat misinformation is to take a moment before you share information. This goes with that idea of the interesting if true sharing that I touched on earlier. Is the author an actual expert? Is this written by a climate scientist, by a plastic pollutions expert, by a marine biologist, whatever topic at hand, are they a credentialed expert? If not, because most scientists are not journalists or communicators, do they cite trustworthy expert sources? So if you have an article from New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, whatever news source, are they citing people who have credentials? Going back to that media chart, who is the publisher or sponsor of the information? Going through and reading articles, what does the article match up with the headline? Is this another interesting if true case? And then you can use fact-checking websites, and one that Dr. John Cook kind of spearheads is skepticalscience.com, and they have so many debunkings, rebuttals of climate change misinformation. They go by topic. There is a toolbar on that website where you can, it has like the top 10 most popular myths. You can search the website for your myth. So misinformation is always growing and changing and shifting. But I would be pretty confident in saying if you are encountering climate misinformation, Skeptical Science has a rebuttal for it. And they are written purposefully to be very easy to comprehend, easy to understand. Some of them are written like easy, medium, hard, so that if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the science, you can read that, or you can just stick with the easy, and it's very, very simple. So I love Skeptical Science, clearly, but that's a really great resource for when you're scrolling social media and your friend is sharing misinformation. You can just pop on over to that website, look at the rebuttal, and share that information. And again, the media bias chart applies here as well, not only for identifying misinformation, but then for looking at how to work against it and find reputable sources. So these are all linked when you get the PDF version of my slides in your inbox. Skeptical Science is that rebuttal website where they have this whole library of myths. We have handbooks that the Center for Climate Change Communication has worked on. The link will take you almost there. Then you have to click on handbooks under resources. One of them that I spearheaded is Climate Myth Debunking for Broadcast Meteorologists, which is geared towards broadcasters, but can really be used by anybody. And then they have a more general debunking handbook that works for any type of misinformation. My references are also linked. One of my favorite books that you can check out, this is Foolproof by Sander van der Linden. It is highlighted in the references Google Doc if you want to find it more easily. And then Language of Climate Politics is also referenced in that Google Doc and highlighted. So if you scroll and look for the yellow highlights, you'll find both of these books. But these are two of my favorite misinformation resource books if you're looking to pick up and read. And then this reference Google Doc is essentially my dissertation references. So it's got a whole library of misinformation research and things that you can read. And then the last resource that I have for you here is the Cranky Uncle Inoculation Game by Dr. John Cook, who runs Skeptical Science. This is what I was talking about with the cartoon with the surgeon who says, relax, I have a degree in computer science. This game you download onto your iPhone or Android, and you can play through this game where you learn about misinformation techniques through the use of cartoons. It's pretty engaging. I've played it with college students. I've played it with juniors and seniors in high school. So it is a little bit silly, but definitely makes it really easy to see these logical fallacies. It's not always quite so clear as a surgeon who says, relax, I have a degree in computer science, but it does a really good job of paralleling and saying, here is the argument you might have heard. It is just like a surgeon with a degree in computer science. And with that, I am happy to take questions. Thanks again so much for having me. My email and my contact or LinkedIn profile are here. And this presentation template was not me. It's a wonderful website called SlidesGo that does really, really wonderful PowerPoint presentation templates. So I will stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much for that great presentation. We definitely have questions, and I'm sure there are more questions people have. If you would please put them in the Q&A box. First question is, what percentage of credit for disinformation or misinformation should be given to AI algorithms?
This is a really good question that I get a lot. And I think since AI is so new, there's not a super, like, I can't tell you like 80% of misinformation from AI algorithms. I think right now it has more to do with how the algorithm cycles you. So that if you were to click on something that says climate change is not real, the algorithm then recognizes your thinking patterns and is going to show you more of climate change is not real. So for me at least, instead of giving you a percentage, I would say it has more to do with what you click on and then how the algorithm takes that and runs with it. There is kind of an AI war of sorts going on where we can train AI to debunk misinformation, but AI can also be trained to create misinformation. So it's kind of a whole mess out there. So that's not quite a clear percentage, but I hope that's kind of helpful on the two sides of the coin that we're facing with AI.
That's great, thank you. Are there individuals or organizations that are very focused on generating and dispersing climate misinformation? And how can we stop that, given that we have the First Amendment?
Right. So a couple that I, off the top of my head, know, a big one is the Heartland Institute. Right-leaning political think tank, fossil fuel funded. I hate to use the phrase follow the money because it's so overused, but truly follow the money. Many of the organizations on that right-leaning side of the media bias chart will tend to take information from the Heartland Institute, things funded by the Koch brothers, KOCH, really anything with fossil fuels as the funding is truly like where most of this purposeful disinformation is coming from. And there is no way to truly stop it because we do have the First Amendment, which is why it is so important to do the work of debunking. I have friends and colleagues at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who asked me a couple summers ago to do some research for them and see, is it worth it for them to debunk misinformation in their comments? They might post an article and they would get people saying, this isn't true, the opposite is true. And then they had people who were spending time rebutting those comments. And I said, please keep doing this. The research shows it's very important. That's really our best weapon. And it's especially our best weapon when it is with people who you know, because you have that pre-existing relationship, that people are more likely to trust you because they know you. We know that that is not always the case. There is always that person on social media who is going to just poke the bear and never stop. But another kind of rule of thumb is that you will hear from people who are very vocal on either side of an issue, but you won't hear from the people who just kind of casually scroll by. So if you are in the middle of this back and forth and you're trying to debunk misinformation and the person who you're talking to just does not get it, there's other people who might be reading that exchange and looking at what you're saying and believing you. So that's also kind of important to think about, is that this is really our best effort, is to be boots on the ground doing the work of rebutting and debunking misinformation.
On the media bias chart, there was a huge amount of information in kind of a small graphic space. And people were wondering about some of their favorite news sources, particularly NPR and PBS.
Let me back it up. I can reshare my screen while I dig through this so you don't just have to stare at me. And if you find it before me. All right, so PBS is, I don't know if you can see my my pointer, but it is skews left, but mostly fact reporting. NPR used to be in here. They might have, NPR is kind of right in the center, right under NBC.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll leave this up for a minute so y'all can take a look. I know it is quite a lot of information. Like I said, the adfontesmedia.com does have one on their website that is a little bit more condensed and just the more popular news sources, but I was not able to download it. They keep it on their website.
I had to wonder when I watch Nature on PBS and I see the Koch brothers have funded it, how I should look at that. But hopefully there are things about lions and so forth. They're not too political. People are very interested in your slides because we've got great information on slides. I have a question about when we share the slides, how should we credit that? To you, to the citation, to both?
So anything in these slides that is, like, I have parenthetical citations, so stuff that I've taken directly from the research is cited in those parentheses, and you can credit me for the slides because everything else is cited and the references are in that Google Doc.
Great. Yeah, obviously skeptical science is a great resource, but when you cite that to climate deniers, I mean, how do they react? Do they just say that's all misinformation?
What I would recommend doing with skeptical science is then taking it and kind of putting it in your own words almost, which is why the easy level rebuttals that they have are really good to just take a quick look through. And then you as a trusted person, it's easier for you to say, you know, scientists agree that climate change is happening because there's a really good example is there was a treaty that was signed X number of years ago, and a lot of the people who signed it were like the Spice Girls and Mr. Spock. I'm not kidding. It was signed by the Spice Girls. But giving those examples. And again, the people who are just automatically going to think that something like skeptical science is misinformation in and of itself, are not necessarily your biggest audience. Those are the kind of people where if you link to a comment with skeptical science and say, here is more information, and they keep saying that's not true, there's probably someone reading who's going to click on skeptical science and be more open to it.
Great. So how useful is it to point to extreme storms, sea level rise, and other climate impacts on the people that we're communicating with? If they feel their personal impacts are challenged by climate, how much of a difference does that make?
It makes a big difference. There's a lot of research out there that shows that when you can connect to personal experience, people are then more inclined to either believe it, change their minds. I like to give kind of a silly example, but my now husband and I were doing long distance for a year. He got a job up here and I still had class down in Fairfax. So he texted me that he was talking with his parents about offshore wind that is going to be put up on the coast of New Jersey. And a lot of people are up in arms that it's going to ruin their ocean view. It's not. They're going to be far enough away that you will barely see them, but they are stuck on this idea that it's going to ruin their ocean view. So my in-laws apparently were having this discussion, and my mother-in-law was saying, like, it's going to ruin the view. What's like, how is it going to affect the beach? And my husband texted me that apparently my father-in-law said, like, do you want Eric's children and grandchildren to roast? And then like, it seems dumb, but that actually kind of got her thinking, like, oh, if that is what it takes to preserve this landscape or this planet or what have you, it worked. There's a really common saying that climate change kind of loads the dice in favor of those extreme events. Like, we cannot say that a hurricane was directly caused by climate change, but there is evidence that it was made stronger. There's another resource that I can put in the chat that Climate Central does that talks about how climate change kind of shifts the baseline for this. I think that might have just gone to host and panelists. I scroll down, I still don't have everyone. So if someone can put that in the everyone chat, that would be great, because
I'll send it.
Cannot seem to figure it out.
No problem. So how do you answer someone who says they read a lot of climate literature and they came to a different conclusion? And so a person said that happened to them today while collecting signatures for a climate petition.
That can go almost two ways. If you feel comfortable asking what climate literature they've read and what their sources are, then that gets you kind of into a deeper conversation about what's your source and what's your literature. Literature to me as an academic PhD means peer-reviewed science, and overwhelmingly that says one thing, not the other. But to someone else, doing, the phrase "do your own research" means reading any old source that comes up on the Google. So that's a tough one to answer. So if you feel comfortable talking about sources, great. Go into what are your sources and think about the background. This is also often somebody who is not going to have their mind changed. If you have some sort of an easy resource to send them, whether it is something like the Skeptical Science website that you can point them in that direction, or if you can point them in the direction of like one of the NOAA websites that explains climate change. That's probably the easiest way to go about it, is that if you don't want to have this long discussion about, well, who are your sources, point them towards something like NOAA, NASA, Skeptical Science, that they can go and look for themselves again.
Mm-hmm. Great. We get that the media bias chart is getting a lot of interest. One person is asking, how often do they meaningfully update the chart? That they've used an older one for years.
They upload it pretty frequently. Like, I get emails from them, I want to say quarterly, that they've updated it. But they also have the interactive media bias chart, and put that in the chat. It is even more busy than the one I put on. And you can search and filter sources and look for an individual source. And that is updated quite frequently. They're really, really good at keeping this current.
Was also wondering about Amy Goodman's Democracy Now. Where would that be on the media chart if it is?
Let me look. It is loading for me. It looks like it is leaning somewhere strong left and middle ground.
Mhm.
But if you go to that interactive chart that Jen just put in the chat for you, you can search that and that will have your answer.
Mhm. You've been working a lot with college students. What are some of their thoughts and feelings about how we should best handle this issue in the long term?
It's a good question. I think a lot of my students are very interested in this kind of debate that was brought up of First Amendment, freedom of speech, regulation. We've also talked a lot about it with like internet privacy, and because it kind of crosses the same sort of wavelengths, that there isn't a magic bullet for misinformation, but that long term it's going to be a lot of literacy training almost, that like we train people to recognize AI content and we train people to do their research correctly and know what a good source is. And I think that's kind of where it's going to be headed with AI and all of that.
Related to that question is, what ages do you think are most receptive to your messages about misinformation and disinformation?
I think having spent so much time in kind of this world, I feel like there is a space in kind of the K-12 world for just information literacy point blank.
Mhm.
Like I said with my AP bio teacher who used to say, cut off all the jibber jabber and just stop the .net, look at the website. Very basic, but that's still consider your source information literacy. It's something that I've been meaning to kind of talk about with my former high school teacher turned mentor friend. And I go speak with her class every so often and talk about misinformation and disinformation. And they're always really interested in like the implications and what that means and where it comes from. So I think information literacy starts in the K-12 world, and then we get a little bit more in detail, in depth with high school students, college students, a little bit more in depth with specific subject matter. But I really do think that in a tech world, it needs to be a basic K-12 information literacy kind of a thing.
For the schools that aren't lucky enough to have you come and speak to their students, how much is this, if this is getting into curriculum?
So I'll put another link in the chat. The Cranky Uncle game has been used in classrooms all over the world. There's a whole this link that I will post. They've used it in middle schools through college classrooms, but this is a really good resource because it's very easy to understand, very kid-friendly. I've seen another question in the chat about K through 8. I would say maybe not K through 5, but 6 through 8 is a good cranky uncle audience as well. And it's fun, engaging. I really like it as a learning resource.
I think a lot of us would like to do more of the kind of things that you're talking about, but got a question about other organizations where climate activists can practice doing this. That a person comes up with proposals for the latest and greatest technology and sometimes finds himself lacking enough expertise to counter the proposal.
I think that's where skeptical science comes in, is that you don't have to be a ready-made expert. That was part of the reason that I did the climate myth debunking for broadcast meteorologist handbook, is that I was hearing similar things when I talked to broadcasters, that they were saying, you know, I don't have all this knowledge in the back of my head to just immediately pull it out. So those resources like those handbooks and skeptical science, you don't have to have it you have to have the resource in your back pocket. You don't need to have that in-depth knowledge in your back pocket, just the will and the couple minutes to take that information and bring it to the people with whom you are speaking.
When people bring up tipping points, how do you deal with that?
Tipping points is in like, can't go back, sort of.
I'm not entirely sure because I read you the entire question, but I think probably what they're getting at is the idea that we are going to suddenly stumble upon a tipping point and things will become unmanageable after that. Although first, you put that in the Q&A. If I butchered that, please put the right version of your question in.
Yeah, so I think the biggest message is that there is hope. You know, we talk about all these tipping points, and even I am like not sure about what the latest tipping point that we have tipped over has been. That can also be, if you think about misinformation from the other end, you know, there is sort of maybe under the umbrella of alarmism, but you hear a lot about like climate doomerism, that it's too late and we've hit this tipping point and we can't go back. You still need to have some kind of hope, and it's not maybe quite as doom and gloom as that like tipping point world is ending apocalypse would have you say. I can't remember exactly what she said, but there's a climate communicator by the name of Katharine Hayhoe who is really, really good with this, and I recommend looking her up. We'll also put her name in the chat, but she said something along the lines of like any temperature increase reduction is good. It's not like we have to be perfect. I wish I had that quote better memorized, but it's something along the lines of progress is progress.
I remember saying like every 1/10 of a degree is important.
Yes, it's like that.
But I don't have it exactly either. So if anybody does, please let us know. How do you respond to people who claim that climate activists have a financial interest in promoting our narrative due to getting grants and so forth, and try to make that analogous to financial interests of fossil fuel promoters?
If you look up Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, she has a YouTube channel and she has a video that exactly goes into this topic of money and all of that. No, from like a personal standpoint, no climate scientist I know is getting rich from their grant money. There's also somewhere out in the internet world is Katharine Hayhoe has done a breakdown of where her grant money goes. Supplies, publishing fees, conference fees, paying postdocs and graduate students and researchers, paying for, when you do surveys with human subjects, you usually have to like pay people an incentive to take your survey. There are so many expenses that go with research, and there's somewhere she breaks it down and like what she actually pockets from $1 million grant. short answer, Catherine Ayo's video. Longer answer from I've never met a rich climate scientist from grants ever in my many years in academia. But I think her resources are a really good one for that one because, again, I have that personal experience, so I can, but everyone doesn't have that personal experience of being able to say that. So Catherine Ayo's resources, I think, are really good for making those points.
Got a question about who produces the media truck, the Fontes Media. You know, who are they, and can we trust what they say?
I think I saw a response somewhere in the chat.
I think Todd was saying, look at the website.
Yeah, they're not, I don't know exactly who it is, but they're very like, they are not pushing media one way or the other. They're not going to tell you go to PBS. They are not going to tell you go to BBC. They're just going to tell you, here are the news sources that are most trustworthy and most center politically. Do with that what you will.
Great. So, yeah, how do different demographic groups respond to climate disinformation, and how can our messaging be tailored to reach diverse audiences? And what legal and ethical frameworks should govern this fight against climate disinformation? So, kind of two questions in one.
I think the demographically misinformation does tend to follow the political spectrum, that people who lean right on the political spectrum tend to fall for the climate misinformation. Other side of the coin, people who lean super left might be more apt to lean towards the doomerism, tipping points, other side of the misinformation coin. Because we talk a whole lot about like the fossil fuel climate misinformation, but there is that misinformation if we can't go back. So I do want to give that its own right. But when from kind of the lens of what we've been talking about, it does tend to be people who vote Republican or identify as conservative. As far as the legal and ethical frameworks, it really kind of is these grassroots movements, right? Because we cannot just take away the First Amendment. The government cannot regulate what is going out there. And even, there are perceptions, Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now is a private company fully within their rights to censor information, but then people call First Amendment when information gets censored. So it's a very murky, very gray area kind of an issue that I think, again, does have to come from this grassroots movement of people doing that kind of work.
Yeah, we haven't gotten through all the questions because this is such a great topic and we're getting so much good information from you. I don't know if you're going to have time to hang out with us during the action party, but if you do and you'd like to take more questions, we certainly have more questions available. But I want to turn over at this point to Liz to get us started with our action party.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for hanging out for this last 15 minutes of the national call for our action party with Climate Action Now. As always, we're super happy to be here, and we're always very grateful for y'all for spending the time with us to take some direct action and send out some messages to legislators, business decision makers, and media. I've also got on the call with me today, Kaylee Beam. If you haven't met Kaylee yet, she's our newest director of content, which means she's our new Matthew, and we're super excited that she's on the team. So she'll be here today to support with this action party. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so we can get this QR code up for y'all. All right, are you guys seeing the goal tracker that comes up here with the blue marble?
We can see it.
Awesome, thanks, Francis. Alrighty, so if you've done it before, you know the drill. Just go ahead and scan the QR code. If this is your first action party, what you'll need to do is take out your phone. You're gonna hold up your camera lens over this QR code, this little thing. And then when you see a yellow bubble pop up on your phone, you'll click that and that will take you to where you need to go to download the app. Once you've downloaded the app, you'll have to get a profile set up and then you can rescan this QR code and it will take you to our curated list of actions that relate to greenwashing and disinformation. So today we're going to aim for 350 actions. We've already got a few actions in the bank from folks who have been taking those actions ever since I published the campaign yesterday. So we've already got 170 folks out there in the universe working on sending these misinformation and disinformation actions. And y'all are going to add your contributions to getting that number up. Cool. So I think I will take this down and start sharing it in my little photo block, and we can chat a little bit about some of the actions you are seeing come up. And last week, or last month, if y'all remember, if you were on that call, we tried a new version of the action party where we were offering some web form versions of these actions as well. So that's something new that Climate Action Now has been working on developing, because we know that not everyone loves using an app. And Kaylee is going to be dropping some of those links to access a few of the actions we're providing today on web form version. If you're an avid Climate Action Now app user, unfortunately that feature of using the actions online is not yet integrated with the app in terms of getting points and getting trees planted with those points. So keep that in mind if you are trying to make a choice between the two methodologies. But we do have about 11 actions that we'll share throughout the course of the 15 minutes today with you guys that will be accessible on the web form version. But otherwise, just feel free to use this regular QR code methodology with the goal tracker as we always do on these calls. All right, so in terms of some of the actions that we've got going on in here, our first action, tell the Federal Trade Commission to stop plastic companies from making false recycling claims. That's a big one. If you're in Florida, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, we've got some state-specific actions that will come to you based on your location preference that you've set in your profile. For Florida, we've got tell the Department of Education Commissioner to keep climate science in textbooks. If you're in Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, there's an appeal to newspapers asking them to connect the dots between climate change and weather disasters. A little bit into this campaign, you'll see a watch option, a video for how to spot greenwashing, which I'm sure will jive nicely with what you guys have learned today from Margaret. There's an action asking the House of Representatives to report on the fossil fuel industry's climate disinformation. You can tell your members of Congress to ignore the fossil fuel industry's lies. We've got a read action in here about learning about the Masters of Beef misinformation campaign. A great video where you can learn how the coal industry has lied about climate change throughout its history. And while I'm here, I'll share that we are just about to release a new feature in the Climate Action Now app that will make it super easy for us to connect actions to any city council that is in a city of more than 100,000 people. Up until this point, we've got our very small team of dedicated folks at Climate Action Now who manually go through and find all the contact information for city council members. So we're super excited that we're going to be expanding our ability to send out messages to local officials. So if you have anything in mind for local actions in a city you live in, that's more than 100,000 people, feel free to connect with the Climate Action Now team, and it'll be super easy for us to get some of those actions out to people in your community. Nice, looks like we're getting up there in terms of actions, getting close to that 300 threshold. Just a few more and we'll get up to that goal of 350.
I think we can get past 350. We'll see.
I hope so.
Yeah, we might have to update the goal. It's ticking up pretty quick.
Yes, definitely. Ooh, there's 300, y'all. That's awesome.
While we're doing that, maybe we'll go back to the questions for a little bit.
Great.
We had a question. Oh, I can find it now. About how climate disinformation has changed over time. We're talking about in the past being involved in a walk across the country and their experience at the time with the people that they met, and what they used as their authorities for that. What have you seen in terms of how this is changing over time? What kind of impacts that has on society, having this persistent climate disinformation?
Yeah, so I think the big impact on society is delaying the actions that we need. If the message is out there that we don't need to do anything about this, that it's not real, all these misinformation claims, then people don't think that anything needs to be done, whether that is at the policymaker level or at our level of what we tell our policymakers that we want. So it's a pretty big sweeping societal impact in that it's had that power to deter that action by creating doubt that either it exists or that something needs to be done. The big shift that I have kind of seen, but the research is definitely showing, is that we've gone from straight up denial that climate change is happening to denial that we need to do something about it. So that when I showed the cards taxonomy with the misinformation claims, the number 4 that climate solutions won't work, and the number 5 that climate scientists are not trustworthy, they're in it for the money, what have you. Those are kind of been on the rise. So it's definitely kind of a paradigm shift away from this is not happening to this is happening, but we don't need to do anything about it, or we can't do anything about it, or the scientists are not trustworthy.
And that's a really important shift, I think, for us to be aware of. I think you've answered some of these in the Q&A, but just because not everybody's looking at the Q&A, what do you think is the one best thing we can do right now to confront and mitigate climate change?
To quote Catherine Hayhoe, and I know this one because it's in my dissertation, the number 1 thing we can do is talk about it, to make people aware that it's a problem, to make people concerned about it enough to take action, but also to give people actions to take. So just like y'all are doing right now, you're not just sitting here listening to me say, oh, misinformation's a problem. You're doing something about it, which is one of the most important parts of this whole thing is, making people feel like we can do something about it. So talking about it is that big one. And then I think kind of these grassroots things, voting with the climate in mind, taking actions even individually. I think there was a dialogue either in the chat or the Q&A where, we need all these little puzzle pieces. We need to have, if we have 10,000, I'm just one person bringing my reusable bags to the store, that's a big impact. So it's things from even these silly, quote unquote, silly, not really silly, but sometimes perceived as silly little things like reusable bags, reusable water bottles, backyard composting, carpooling, I could go on, to asking Congress, local city councils, what have you, for these more grandiose, sweeping policy-based actions.
That's great. There's so much in the chat and in the Q&A. I'm trying to see what I've missed. As you've got people very excited.
And I'll hop in and say we reached our goal of 350, which is awesome. So bumped it up to 450. So let's try to get another 100 actions in these last 5 minutes.
And Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're at 3,500 actions for the year before we started tonight. If we could get 500, we would be at 4,000 actions, which would be really cool. So we're getting close.
I think we're somewhere in that neighborhood. Yes.
Nice. Love to hear it.
And somebody pointed out that Catherine Hayo's TED Talk about the importance of talking about climate change is linked in the chat. There's lots of good information in the chat. If people aren't used to downloading the chat, you'll get this information later. But if you just can't wait, click on those 3 dots at the bottom of the chat window. But you'll be getting a recording and other good information very soon. So don't worry that you're missing something.
And I just planted a tree. I don't know if anybody else has planted a tree tonight. That's always a fun thing. We get to plant trees at the same time that we take action.
I got a tree yesterday, but I think I'm getting close to another one.
That's awesome. Always love a good tree experience in the apps. Like
I've now taken 75 actions today.
Wow, you're much faster than I am.
Awesome.
That's awesome, Leslie.
Well, I started this morning with my usual coffee and climate action. And so that laid a base, but yeah.
Good start. Oh, wow, Beverly, 500 trees. Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
We should, that's a fun one that we should do, is figure out who out of ECA has planted the most trees in a year and like give out a special award or something. That would be a fun little recognition each year. Maybe it's our top 5 or something.
Yeah.
Tree planters.
Oh, I love that. I'll have to
I don't
pass
think
that
I
on.
can. I probably can't compete with Leslie. I've got a bunch of trees, but I'm not doing 75 actions a day most days.
All right, final stretch. 1 minute left to go. Let's see if we can get up to 450.
Oh, but it said they've got 500 trees. So let's go for 500 actions for 500 trees.
I'll bump it.
Well, I'm behind you. I'm 287 trees, but 287 trees is more than no trees.
Yay.
Yeah, I've got over 2,000 trees, but I've been doing this a long time.
Whether you
I'm
have
sure
5
there-
or 500, every tree goes, it really counts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, I know we're at 5:15. I'm happy to stay on a little longer if that's all right in terms of this Zoom link. If folks want to help achieve Francis's dream today of getting to 500 actions. But Jen, let me know if that doesn't work as well.
I think, I am confident that we will probably get to 550 actions, even if we don't stay on the call, because people will probably just keep going for a few minutes after this call. I think we've done a fabulous job tonight, and I appreciate everybody's time and energy this evening. I think we should say our goodbyes and be good with our 434 actions that we know we took.
Awesome. That sounds good to me.
Thank you again so much, Margaret, for joining us. And thank you, Liz and Kaylee from Climate Action Now, for being part of our national call team and hosting our action parties with us.
And thank you for everybody who's been listening and asking questions and taking actions.